Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Cuddy from the Chicago Humanities Festival, welcoming you to another episode of One Small Object, One Giant Leap into History with our City of Chicago's own cultural historian, Tim Samuelson, who really, that's a true job. That's not just something Tim made up. He is the cultural historian of Chicago, works for the City of Chicago. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Allison, good to see you again.
Good to see you. So this is a very special episode of One Small Object because we have our first ever One Small Object guest, who I'm going to introduce now. Rebecca Graff is a historical archaeologist from Lake Forest College in Lake Forest, Illinois. So happy to have you with us here today, Rebecca. Welcome.
Thanks very much. I'm excited to be on the show.
So we're also mixing things up a little bit this episode because normally we focus on one object or maybe some connected objects. But for this episode, we're going to focus on a specific place in Chicago that's super important in terms of our overall history and our architectural history, and that is Mecca Flats. So I'm going to have Tim, why don't you start us off and tell us a little bit more about the Mecca Flats?
Well, Mecca Flats is a building in Chicago history. It's kind of like a legend. In fact, it's hard to believe that such a place even existed. It was an early apartment building built in Chicago just before the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. In fact, it briefly served as a hotel during the World's Fair. But it had a beautiful skylit central atrium that was 3 stories tall. And so everybody entered their apartment through this big skylit atrium. And of course, part of the story of the building is there were no secrets in Mecca Flats because everybody could see who was coming and who was going. And even early in its history, there are stories of fights breaking out where somebody saw somebody going into somebody else's room to have an affair with somebody's wife or something like that. And but also the dynamic of the building in terms of it was originally had a policy of white-only occupancy. The building was actually an early example of gentrification. It actually took the place of workers' cottages by developers who thought that they were going to try to change what was an old working neighborhood into an upscale neighborhood. The neighborhood evolved very quickly during the Mecca Flats' time into Bronzeville, and so this building became the center of Bronzeville. African-American tenants were allowed in starting in 1911, and within a few years, the occupancy was almost entirely African-American. It was apartments. There's even stories of a woman who wanted to serve down-home cooking, set up her apartment as an informal restaurant where you could get real Southern cooking if you went in there. There's also stories of, the great poet laureate of Illinois, Gwendolyn Brooks, working for a faith healer in the Mecca Flats and dropping a job that she hated, dropping off magic voodoo charms to people in the building, knocking on the doors and meeting people throughout the building, which she then later made into an extended poem called In the Mecca. The building continued. Illinois Institute of Technology bought the building. They tried to tear it down. The neighbors had a revolt, and actually they were able to keep the building standing until it was torn down in 1952. But it got a lot of publicity. It was many people's homes. It was often vilified in the press as this terrible place at the end, but really it was a people's home, and people were proud of it. And there's even a man that was interviewed at the end, and he said, "You watch, people's hearts are going to be broken when they tear this place down." Of all things, it's one of the only cases I know where an important building got torn down and replaced by an important building. Usually when they get replaced by junk. But in this case, it's Mies van der Rohe's classic Crown Hall at IIT, considered one of the great hallmarks of modern architecture and one of Mies's masterpieces. So when you looked at the building there, and even the footprint footprint similar to that of Mecca Flat, you think, well, nothing left of Mecca Flats. Well, that turned out not to be the case. And that's where Rebecca comes in.
Oh, right. So, Rebecca, you're an archaeologist. How did your practice and your interests bring you to the Mecca Flat? How does it figure into your work?
Well, I think Tim's being very modest because he was instrumental in actually bringing me into this project. He supports the sort of understanding that we can get from doing archaeology in addition to doing the architectural history. But when Tim contacted me and told me that they thought they had found the basement level of the Mecca Flats intact because of construction, infrastructural improvement to Crown Hall, I was very excited to get in there. I was about to start my own a new excavation at a site in Irving Park neighborhood. So I was very busy, but I had to drop everything and come out. And what I was really interested in at these sites, you know, even if we don't have the standing architecture left, we have the items that people used and lived, and that kind of way to understand how the sites were used and understood by people. I was lucky because my first big excavation in Chicago, was at the former site of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. So I knew that time period very well. This was a building that had that connection to it, but I was just so excited because, again, it was a building that I had learned about, educating myself about the architecture and the history of Chicago. To have a chance to maybe get in there was really, really exciting.
So before we get to the people's objects, let's just circle back to the architecture, because, you know, Tim, you started by saying it's like a marvel. It's hard to imagine that a building like this existed. And certainly, you know, I think some people point to Crown Hall as a marvel as well. But what architectural remnants of the Mecca Flats do you have? Like, how can you bring us into the space of the building?
We knew a lot about Mecca Flats from old photographs and descriptions of it, but it's interesting that Rebecca's excavation solved some mysteries. I can remember writing about the Mecca Flats and describing it according to old descriptions as being a gray building. Well, what shows up in the excavations but one of the original Roman bricks, and the building was a beautiful rosy red. So this is thanks to excavations at the site. Now, the piece that I have of the old ornamental ironwork of the atrium, it was kind of like a New Orleans street turned inside out. It weighs a few hundred pounds, so I can't lift it up here. But here is a little small piece of the iron newel post from 1893, and that'll give you the idea, kind of the beauty of the building. And the building also, there's many artifacts. The building was kind of a legend in its own time. The activities of people coming and going in Mecca Flats achieved such renown. It was actually part of I'll put it here like this, famous blues song called the Mecca Flat Blues, which tells the adventures of the Mecca Flat man and the Mecca Flat woman. One of the lines is, "Keep fooling with me and I'll cut your jazzer down." They meant business in Mecca Flats.
Your jazzer, whoa. Something also lost to history, that terminology. Well, that music brings us back to the people, Rebecca. So let's talk a little bit about your excavation, how you went about it, and what you found, and what it tells us about that community.
So this is something I would characterize as like a salvage excavation. We went in while things had already been dug up by the construction workers who were just thinking they were putting this trench in so they could do the infrastructural improvements. And what we were doing was not going and looking in, you know, with small picks and finding things that hadn't been touched or seen since then, but we were going through the piles of dirt that had been removed. And so not only did we see the actual floor of the Mecca, which, as Tim said, was just vibrant, these beautiful encaustic tiles that would have been, you know, the height of expense and of, you know, the trend at that time when they were used in the basement as well, not in just the main floors. But going through these piles of materials, they had been removed from their original context, which in archaeology we're not as interested in, but then they were also in a big context of the mixed up things of what happened when Mecca gets demolished in 1952. And so what we were seeing was not just one little slice of time, but we were seeing objects that may have been left behind throughout the lifetime of the building, you know, you lose something small and it's just there, and an archaeologist is excited to get it. But you're also seeing the lives of the people, and that moment of, you know, the sort of structural racism that creates the possibilities for the demolition of this, the demolition of this important structure into the community. So we found a lot of interesting stuff. Some of it probably dating to the original building of the Mecca, and some of it right to 1952.
So walk us through some of those objects.
Okay, well, I have a few things. I went to my lab to grab them. And one thing was, one of the most exciting things that I found, that I got to find in Chicago was, well, a bottle. We find bottles all the time. This is just a small amber bottle. But what was so cool about this bottle is that it was full of pills when we found it. So it wasn't just an empty bottle that we, you know, use our techniques to find out what was inside, you know, what it was, but it had the pills inside. So a very intimate look into that. So I was very lucky that one of my students, who was a major in chemistry and in sociology, anthropology, Nebojsa Markovic, was very lovely and willing to sort of take this on. And he actually did an analysis of the pills and made aspirin in the lab with the help of one of my colleagues, Erica Schultz, in chemistry, and determined they were indeed aspirin, which if you look at it, it looks like an aspirin bottle. What we did in lab with one of my other students, Lexi Nokolic, we looked at the bottom of the bottle, and the bottoms of these bottles give information about company who manufactured it, when a lot of these bottles were actually made. They put all these codes. So while we don't have the label to know what brand of aspirin or what exactly was there, we know that this was an Illinois Owens bottle that was manufactured between 1932 and 1952.
Oh, cool.
So very nice, tight date. So just sort of that, and aspirin becomes this really popular drug in the 1890s when it's made and mass produced. So it fits perfectly the entire time of the Mecca. So that was one interesting thing. I'm always interested in the sort of health and hygiene and medicine and things about when I'm thinking about archaeological objects. You ready for another one?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So maybe this is the opposite of the health, which would be, this is the stem of a white clay smoking pipe. So these were very common objects that I found in every single excavation I've done in Chicago, except for one. And they're manufactured starting in the late 16th century. People start making, in Europe, they're making these smoking pipes, and they're continued to be used. You see them in a lot of colonial sites in the United States. You think like Boston. But we find them in Chicago. And so this is someone's tobacco pipe. This would have been just the stem. It would have had the bowl. It probably wouldn't have been very long. But you can just imagine someone sort of smoking in the communal part of the Mecca, taking their break after a long day's work. Men and women, of course, use these. So they're just really another kind of little intimate look into the people who are there. So here we have someone having some aspirin after a long day. Here's someone having a smoke. So I have one more set of things. Okay. So then these, we also again found through the salvage, are marbles. And there are one little one and two big ones. The little one is really interesting because it's an older type of marble. It's called the Bennington marble, and it's made of ceramic. And these are made in the 19th century to the really early 20th century. So it's an old marble. And then these two ones, one is partially burnt and melted. And this one are glass, machine made, so to 20th century. But of course, who do you usually think about using marbles? And this gets us, the children of Mecca, back into thinking about the site. And if we think about the public spaces of these atriums with the light, and the space that maybe you don't have in your home, but communally in public, you can imagine children playing marbles, probably being very upset if they lost a favorite marble. But to find them, and you know, these are probably different children. These are very different ages of marbles, but that continuity of the children of Mecca playing games and being there is, we know they're there. We see them in photographs, we see them in the documentary record, but it's another kind of look at that and reminder when you find the things that they lost.
you know, you talked about early on, and I want to hear from both of you, you know, that Tim encourages that the excavation of these more contemporary, I mean, sometimes we think of archaeologists and we think of the ancient world and, you know, ones that have been lost to us for a long time as opposed to 19th, 20th century sites. Why is it important, as you were saying, to do excavations of these sites in Chicago? Why should we treat these fairly contemporary, maybe more prosaic, an apartment building as storied as it is, as important sites for understanding the history of our city?
I love that question. So thank you for asking it. I think a lot, because that's what a lot of my own work is that. And I'd love to hear how Tim also thinks about this too, with his expertise in architecture. So much of what we do as humans is not necessarily recorded. So it's not recorded in a documentary record. It's not, you know, in a photograph necessarily. We might go to see an archive somewhere and someone wrote down what they did. The daily prosaic things, those are not usually included. And then if we think about whose stories are the ones that are usually kept, the ones that we refer to and think about when we talk about Chicago, it's often a certain set of, you know, elite white men who are more often than not the ones whose stories are captured. So archaeology as another line of evidence of human meaning can get us to a fuller story, and also of these sort of like small things that maybe you think, oh, it's the 19th century, they did the same things, it looks the same, but they thought of things and used some of the same products and lived their lives in ways that are both very familiar and very unfamiliar. So the time period that I'm interested in, a lot of people do work on because it seems so close, but it actually is very different at the same time. And all of this, I think, can help us understand a little bit more about how we are living in Chicago right now.
Tim, what would you add? Why is it important to understand these sites through architecture, through, you know, archaeology and rescuing architectural artifacts?
A large part of my own research has been in Chicago architecture. And one of the great tragedies in the city's history is that there were many important early buildings that were done by Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan that were on the south and the west sides of Chicago. And through the complex conditions that involve urban renewal and the mass destruction of these buildings in the 1950s, when they would tear these buildings down, they weren't anticipating anybody building anything on the site right away. So to fill the ground to the site to ground level, they would take the rubble from the building and fill what was the former basement. So I watch many of these vacant lots like a hawk waiting for somebody to build there again. And you will actually find actual artifacts of ornamentation and details of these historic buildings. I mean, we know it's not like an archaeology where you don't know what's in there. You know what to expect. It's the rubble of a late 19th, early 20th century building. But you can find out information, even like what was the color of the brick of these buildings? What was the ornamentation made of? In some cases, you find pieces of the ornamentation itself. There's an early Frank Lloyd Wright building that was on 43rd Street that was torn down in 1971. In fact, I salvaged things from it and I watched them fill the basement with the artifacts. And I've been visiting that site periodically to see if anything would happen there, thinking that when they did, I'd be able to find all these pieces of this lost Frank Lloyd Wright building. Well, I was telling this to somebody and they said, oh, there's a new condo on that site. I said, oh no, really? And I went down there, sure enough, I missed it. So I guess I have to pay closer attention.
It's hard to keep your eye on everything happening in this city, especially in a moment of intense development. But I have another maybe final question, which is, you both invoke the history of race and segregation in Chicago as we think about the Mecca Flats, and certainly that's in its history, and transformation from a white space to a black space. But also it sounds like in terms of the demise of the building and maybe the response to the effort to take it down, we can learn more about the history of race in Chicago. Could you speak to that a little bit, Rebecca?
Oh, absolutely. Well, one thing that was really excellent about this project, again, short project, but that it was not only at the behest of Tim, but also the folks at IIT who own the site, and that their own sort of interest in the history of this structure, not just because it happened to be an important architectural site, and this is an architectural school that was right there, but to understand a little bit more about their own role institutionally in creating the conditions for the demolition of the structure in this neighborhood, and seeing sort of how people understand Bronzeville right now, how this sort of played into that. So getting a chance to think a little bit more about, the restrictive covenants that produced Bronzeville in the way that it was, and how that we can see that, as Tim pointed out, very specifically within the Mecca, the people who live there and the transformation of population. Also, just thinking of the history of the city, the 1919 riots took place in that area, and actually some of the most violent confrontations during the riots were right there. So we can only imagine, the people who maybe used some of these objects, who lived in the Mecca, were affected by that violence. So it gives us a chance to think about, and maybe challenge ourselves to think about, a lot of different moments in our history and what we want sort of for the future in the city.
Tim, the uniqueness of the building, you talked about at the beginning, that this was a very communal space. You talked about it like a New Orleans architecture turned inside out. Has that, that's obviously an important part of our history and thinking of how we've lived together or not lived together. Have we lost that? Is that still part of our architectural landscape, or, is that something that also went away with the demise of a building like the Mecca Flats?
The Mecca was unusual. It was somewhat of an experiment of a building where you had this kind of shared community under glass. And I think many people deemed it wasn't necessarily successful. I don't know if there's the factor of some of the conflicts that broke out from everybody maybe knowing everybody else's business maybe a little too much. But there never was a building that was built quite like this. And even throughout its history, when it was a brand new building, when it was temporarily used as a hotel, the building struggled. In fact, they thought it was going to be filled with people visiting the Columbian Exposition. Hardly anybody showed up. It went broke. They had a hard time renting these big, expansive, multi-room apartments, and they started to break them up very early in the building's history. In fact, there's even stories of how people moved in who were like owners of small businesses and factories, and they had this beautiful multi-room apartment. And then the management started to break the apartments into smaller units. And some of the people who worked in the factory wound up living in the same building. So it made an interesting combination of people in their backgrounds in there, and also the dynamics of transition from a white clientele to an African American clientele. It's also interesting to see that this building was written about in mainstream magazines like Life magazine, Harper's magazine, and they were quick to vilify this as some horrible, horrible place. But if you read the accounts of people who lived there, oh yes, that building had its challenges, but it was people's home. It was people's community. And so that kind of reinforces the whole stories of media and racism and perspective, which is certainly very vital to talk about today. And it was certainly the case when the last days of the Mecca Flats in 1952.
Well, Rebecca, before we let you go, one last final quick question. Where are you digging now?
Oh, right now, in pandemic world, I think it's just my backyard, but I have a lot that I'd like to do. I just finished actually a book about the excavations at the World's Fair and at the Charlie Persky House, which another Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright construction. But Tim has been telling me things for years about some of these sites, and I'm hoping that we would get a chance to collaborate again and maybe look for some of these things to find out a little bit more about the city through the things that people left behind.
Well, thank you, Rebecca Graff, so much for joining us on One Small Object. And as always, Tim Samuelson, our city's cultural historian, thank you for bringing us another great story of our city.
Well, thank you. And this is great. And I'm looking forward to getting the shovel. And you're welcome to join us, Allison, at the next historic site that we want to dig up.
I will be there. I love that. Yeah, as soon as we can. And by the way, if you have an object at home that you think might have a really interesting story behind it, why don't you share it with us? Send us a photo. Thanks again, both of you, for joining us. And thanks to everyone for tuning in to another episode of One Small Object, One Giant Leap into History.